Hello, this is Ronan from Recording Boot Camp, and it's time for another episode of Turbo Monday. This episode I am coming to you from the Wiltern Theater. I am about to see one of my favorite bands in the world, the Tragically Hip, and for some crazy reason they have not asked me to produce an album for them yet. So it is your job, people, to write the band and tell them to get Ronan Chris Murphy to produce their next album. But more importantly, let's see if we can get to some questions. All right, so Chris writes, oh, there we go. Clock starts now. Thank you to engineer John Rod for taking care of that. My drums seem to sound punchier to me when I shift my overheads to phase align with the close mics, but I've heard some say that fixing the alignment between one set of drums causes problems elsewhere. Can you please talk a little bit more about this and the downsides? Well, it's a really, really good question, and I definitely do not discourage you from trying it. But one of the huge myths out there is that you can fix the phase of drum mics. It's absolutely impossible. The really important thing is when you've got phase problems between multi-mic setups, when you start moving them and shifting around, you never fix them. You just screw them up in a way that you might like better. And if you like it better and it works in the tune, that is absolutely cool. But the problem is when you start shifting tracks around, you may align them with the drum, but you've actually shifted the relationship of those mics with the toms, with the cymbals, anything else going on, and even trying to align the snare drum itself. When you keep in mind you have overheads, well, a snare drum is almost a foot wide, and that means sound travels about a millisecond going from one side to the other. So in a sense, you even have phase problems from one side of the snare to the other. So the really important thing is when you're kind of fixing stuff, that you go in, align it, and make sure don't just listen to what you're trying to fix. Make sure that when you do that, you're listening to see what has it done to your kick. Like if you're working with a snare, what has it done to your kick drum? Do your cymbals sound good? Are they getting hollow or washy or nasally? Any of those kinds of things. So never assume that visually you can go in and align something, and anytime you fix something, always make sure you check the other elements to make sure that you haven't hurt them, because when you fix something in a multi-mic setup, you are always hurting something else, and it's your choice as the mixer and as the producer to decide where you want to balance those. Personally, I actually usually don't do that. You know, I will invert phase on the kick drum to see if it sounds better, room mics and things like that. But if there's a big problem, I will go in and shuffle things around. But most of the time, I find that I really don't need to. If I get my EQ right and build out of the smallest number of mics possible, I can usually get a pretty darn good drum sound. So we got time for a couple more, I think. So Tommy writes, on average, how much low end do you roll off from the main vocal track? Awesome question. You guys have been sending me great questions, and again, keep going here and sending me more. But Tommy, the big question is as much as I can. And go and listen to a lot of your favorite records, and you might be stunned how much low end gets rolled off. And because when we start to cut low end from a voice, you actually reduce a lot of conflict between the lower frequency instruments, and it can actually make a voice sound more clear, more defined, kind of pop out of the mix without having to be as loud. And the really important thing is when you're trying to determine how much low end to cut away from that you are listening with the low frequency stuff in the mix. So bass guitar or bass synth or Fender Rhodes, whatever you've got in there playing that role, make sure you hear that combined. Because you can EQ a voice that actually sounds really thin on its own, but then when you drop the bass in, it sounds big and rich and full, which is very cool. But one thing you want to make sure you're aware of if you do this technique is if you have a section in the song like a bridge or a quiet verse where maybe the bass drops out, you might want to go in and automate that cut. So cutting lots of low frequencies when there's a lot of bass going on, but when the bass goes away, that you kind of bring some of that back in, and that'll keep the voice sounding great all the way. And just a little bit of time for the last one. Hey man, would you share some tips on dialing in the right attack time on the compressor, whatever the source might be? you know, we spend a whole day just on compression in my boot camps because it's a really deep thing. But the way to simplify it is really think about attack times and transients. That is how you are manipulating the transients. So the faster you go, the more transients are going to be reduced, and the slower your attack time, the more transients are going to get through. And that's going to have a huge impact on articulation, definition, and how things feel. And so a lot of presence. So things are starting to get loud here too, and 5 minutes is going to be up in just a couple seconds. And so that is it. Please send me more questions down here. I love answering them, and I will get back to them. And it's almost time for one of my favorite bands in the world, the Tragically Hip. There we go. Thanks.